2 for our booster training of Tier 3. We want to welcome our colleagues from across the nation. So welcome, Colorado. We're so happy to see you in the house today. Welcome, Vermont, Minnesota, New York, Ohio, and of course, Massachusetts. We're thrilled. So just to have a couple things on hand today, in addition to water and snacks, because those are always good to have on hand, other things that may be handy are some of the forms we're going to be reviewing today. So we have the assessment form, which can be found in Appendix 3 of the workbook. We have the treatment planning form, which is Appendix 7 in the workbook, and the priority problem form, which is Appendix 6. And also we put together, and by we, I mean Amy Pepiora, put together a handout for today that goes through and scaffolds a little bit with some reflection questions and also a place for notes. So feel free to use that to anchor yourself in the training today. Just as an overview for our agenda for day 2, we're going to be doing assessment. We're going to go over some treatment planning, and then we're going to just talk about the concept of ready, set, go and trauma systems therapy for refugees. So first and foremost, pop quiz. We're going to be seeing who was paying attention in day 1. We're not grading, so feel free to just jump in with your answers. So we're going to do 3 questions of review. So in TSTR, we talk about survival in the moment. Survival in the moment is defined as an individual's subjective experience of the present environment as threatening to their survival, with corresponding thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and neurochemical and neurophysiological responses. So our first review question is, in TSTR, what does survival in the moment look like? And your choices are, you can go ahead and fill out. A is fight, flee, or freeze. B is changes in the 3 A's across the 4 R's. And C is a roller coaster of emotions and uncertainty about the future. So go ahead and pick what you think survival in the moment is in TSTR. Do you all see the whole questions? Are we getting any responses?
So we have about 77% of folks are in, so maybe a couple more clicks. And I don't know, Sweet, if you want to end and share.
Oh, okay, excellent. So 62% of people picked changes in the 3 A's across the 4 R's, and that is correct. So in TSTR, we talk about survival in the moment. As changes in the 3 A's, affect, awareness, and action over the 4 R's. And the 4 R's are the continuum of regulation, going from regulation to revving to re-experiencing and reconstituting. So we talk about that shift in the moment, right? When confronted with a traumatic reminder in the environment or when there is a perceived threat. So as a reminder, here we show an uptick, right? So people going up, but people can also down regulate. So you can up regulate when you're re-experiencing, but you can also down regulate. And that looks more like withdrawal and stuff. Okay, next question. We're doing great. So we talked about the 3 A's of regulation, right? And what do the 3 A's stand for in TSTR? So the first one is anger, acceptance, appreciation, or awareness, affect, and advocacy, or affect, awareness, and action. So please give us your, what you think the answer is. How are we doing?
It seems like 72% of people responded, so we'll wait a couple more seconds and then I'll go ahead and end the poll.
Awesome. Oh, whoa, we're hitting it out of the park right now. That's awesome. 88% said affect awareness and action, and that is correct. So we talk about affect, which is emotions or feelings, awareness, which is our focus of attention, our orientation, our sense of self, memories, and thoughts in the moment. And then action, which is behavior. Those are the 3 A's. Nice job, everybody. Okay, our last final quiz question is related to the 4 R's in regulation. So in TSTR, we talk about the continuum of regulation, just like we talked about, regulating, revving, re-experiencing, and reconstituting. Which R can look a lot like regulating? Is it reconstituting, re-experiencing, or revving?
So just again, 70% of people. So I'm gonna wait a few seconds and we'll go ahead and share.
Thank you, Sweet. All right, excellent. So 69% picked reconstituting, and that is correct. Reconstituting can look a lot like regulation, but when people are in reconstituting, they're still vulnerable to shift into re-experiencing. They're not quite in that calm, regulated state yet. All right, excellent job. Thank you for your participation. So again, regulating is being in control. Revving is when you're starting to get upset. Re-experiencing is when you lose control. And then reconstituting is getting it back together again, but still vulnerable to losing it. All right, I will turn it over to my colleague Heidi to begin talking about assessment.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Happy to be with you. So last week, I spoke briefly about assessment in TSTR and the 5 sections of assessment. And we went deeper into section 1, including a review of the core stressors as we talked about what problems would be the focus of treatment. And I'm going to pick up that thread and take us through the rest of the sections, so 2 through 5. Starting with a discussion about the dyadic relationship of cultural broker and clinician during assessment. So you have cultural broker and clinician leading different pieces of this process and doing the work together as well. Your cultural broker will lead facilitating caregiver consent, providing cultural concepts and framing for clinical content, and providing translation and interpretation for the clinician as needed, depending on the language proficiency of the youth and family that you're working with. The clinician on the team will be leading the clinical assessment and providing relevant clinical content for the cultural concepts. And together you have an integration of the clinical and the cultural lens. So together facilitating engagement and explaining the need for assessment, facilitating and participating in meetings with the family and caregivers together. So think about this kind of like a parallel process with some overlap as well, which is part of what's so beautiful about the model and the dyadic work. So section 2 of the assessment form is, why are these problems important and to whom? So here we look at the functional impact of the identified problems. So last week, I think I'd mentioned, consider activities of daily living. Think about social ability, concentration, and judgment, and how those things are impacted by the identified problems. We also look at the level of concern from the child, the family, and others about the episodes of survival in the moment. And lastly, we identify what is most important or concerning to the child, the family, and others. So this is where we assess the child and the caregiver's goals. What do they want to be different? What would they like to see changed? And then whether or not the problems that they are experiencing interfere with them achieving their goals. And the TSTR language for this experience of problems interfering with achieving goals is called the source of pain. So it's the primary hurt or tension that's being experienced. And sources of pain can be different for youth than they are for caregivers, and that's okay. What we do is we gather that information, we tease it out, and then we align the sources of pain if we can, if possible. And we use that information for our engagement strategies as well. So I'm hearing that this is the most challenging thing for you right now. So this is where we're going to start. You would use it for your engagement strategies. Okay, section 3, what interventions will be used to address the youth's problems? So this is determined by assessing the trauma system, which is what we always come back to in TSTR. We have the child's emotional and behavioral dysregulation, and then we have the social environment instability that we would look at. This is where we put youth on the grid. And the grid is where this information comes together about the survival states and the social environment stability. So in order for us, yeah, go ahead, Alicia. In order for us to put a youth on the grid, we have to start by looking at one of these two realms. So let's talk first about survival states. When we're assessing survival states, we look at these 3 categories. So our first is no survival states, and then survival states and dangerous survival states. So when you have a youth who has no survival states, you're working with someone who's able to maintain affect, awareness, and action. Okay, so the 3 A's that we just reviewed, over a usual range of stressors. So here you could have a youth who is still triggered by something, but it doesn't equal survival in the moment. Okay, they're able to maintain the 3 A's. When you have survival states, there is a shift in the 3 A's over a usual range of stressors, but it's not risky or dangerous. So this might look like withdrawn behavior or dissociative behavior or difficulty concentrating, difficulty with social skills, those kinds of survival states that really are not risky or dangerous. And then we have dangerous survival states. And this is where there is a shift in the 3 A's and it's risky or dangerous. So things like physical aggression, recklessness, driving a car without a license, substance abuse, feeling suicidal, threatening to harm other people, those kinds of survival states that really are risky and dangerous. And another important thing to remember here is that regulation is assessed based on a child's vulnerability to switch to survival states. So when the vulnerability goes up, when you have things like chronic stress or lack of connection or lack of coping skills, those kinds of things lead to an increased vulnerability. And when you have an increased vulnerability, you have an increased frequency of survival in the moment. So they would go up together and they would come down together as well. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Doris to read this case example, and we'll talk more about assessing Maria afterward.
Hi, everyone. This case example is, I read this case example the first time, but now we're going to review Maria again. Just as a reminder, Maria is a 15-year-old girl from El Salvador, currently living in Texas with her mother, Sylvia. Maria is regularly missing school. When she attends school, teachers are reporting that Maria will often put her head down during class and becomes disengaged. Maria and Sylvia argue, shout, and break things. Maria reported that her mother has hit her when they argue. Sylvia is reporting that during arguments, especially surrounding a boyfriend that her mother does not approve of, Maria will leave the home at night.
Thank you, Doris. So taking that information and thinking about assessing Maria's survival states, some of the questions that you're going to ask yourself in this process are, is Maria able to regulate her emotions and behaviors when triggered? Based on what we just heard Doris relay to us, we're going to say no, she's not able to regulate her emotions and behaviors when triggered. Is there a shift in affect awareness and action? Based on what we know so far, there is a shift in action. I think, obviously things like leaving home without permission, shouting, breaking things, putting her head down at school, becoming disengaged. These are all actions that really are identifiable for us in this assessment process. For affect and awareness, we have some gaps to fill in here, which we would do through our line of questioning through moment by moments. But these are the things that we would be looking at as we're assessing her survival states. And when looking at the social environment stability, we have these three categories. So we keep it nice and neat, 3 and 3. We have a stable social environment, and this is where caregivers can adequately reduce the vulnerability to switch to survival states, and they can help and protect the youth from perceived threats. So if you think about a stable home environment, for example, think about a caregiver who is attuned to their child's emotional state and who can help co-regulate. This is a place where we have done a lot of work cleaning up the cat hair, and things are feeling stable when you're in this zone. We have distressed, and this is where caregivers cannot adequately reduce the vulnerability to switch to survival states, and they cannot help and protect against perceived threats. So think about a home environment where a provider, a parent, or caregiver is not able to co-regulate. Okay, so when the child gets dysregulated, the parent gets dysregulated, as an example. And then we have threatening social environments, and this is where there's a clear and present danger in the social environment. This is a place, again, where caregivers cannot adequately reduce the vulnerability to switch to survival states, and they can't help and protect. The difference here is that in your distressed environment, they can't help and protect against perceived threats, and in a threatening environment, they can't help and protect against actual threats. See that distinction? So this would be, again, using the home environment as an example, a place where there's potentially emotional abuse or physical abuse, sporadic supervision of young children, those kinds of things going on would be a threatening social environment. And social environment has a lot to do with caregivers and their ability. And I think I want to say here that when you have an engaged caregiver, it can feel hard sometimes to rate the social environment as distressed or threatening. So I want you to think about this as caregivers who are unable to help and protect yet. Okay, so not that they can't do it, but that they're unable to do it right now. There's a difference between being unable to do something and being unwilling to do it. And I think I'm going to say majority of the time we're working with caregivers who are willing, they're just unable. And so that's where our work comes in to help with the scaffolding and the skills for that. Okay. So these are some questions that you would be asking yourself, again, as you work through assessment of Maria's social environment. What are core stressors that Maria's family is struggling with? We talked about core stressors last week. And as a review, we'd be thinking about acculturative stress, resettlement stress, isolation, and trauma. I think based on what we know about Maria's social environment, she's got a little bit of all of these things. We'd also be thinking about the environment. Is it stable, distressed, or threatening? That's a question, a specific question that we're asking in this stage. And we're also thinking about Maria's caregivers. Are they able to help and protect her from perceived threats? or actual threats, and their ability to help her regulate her emotions and behaviors in the face of these threats. So what we know about Maria so far, we know that she is experiencing a lot of dysregulation. And what we know is that her mom is also experiencing quite a bit of dysregulation. So not only does it seem like mom is unable to attune and co-regulate, for example, we know that part of Maria's trauma history is exposure to domestic violence. And when her mom is reacting in this way that is physically abusive towards her in their arguments, it's triggering. So not only is mom unable to assist her with dysregulation, but due to mom's own survival in the moment, she in a way is kind of bringing on survival in the moment states for Maria, if that makes sense. And this is the grid. So this is something that you will use a lot in your work with TSTR. And this is where our social environment sections and survival state sections come together. And when you place a youth on the grid, you're able to answer that question that we started with about what interventions you'll use to address the child's problems. And when we're placing Maria on the grid, okay, we are placing her in having a threatening social environment because of the dysregulation that is happening both with her leaving home without permission and her caregiver not knowing where she is, and also with the way that the arguments are happening between Maria and mom. There are definitely, I think we would say, actual threats in the social environment. And she has survival states. So some behaviors that aren't dangerous, for example, at school, and then she has dangerous survival states as well at home. So we're definitely in safety focused treatment. And we're also going to do some regulation focused work one-on-one with Maria to address her survival in the moment and start working on the skills of that phase. So we'll have in part focusing on caregivers and the social environment stability as you would in safety focused treatment, and also some regulation focused work one-on-one. And these are our 3 different phases. I will just talk briefly about what each of these phases looks like. So if you assess your youth, the youth that you're working with to be in safety focused treatment, your major tenets of this phase are prioritizing safety, reducing survival states, organizing services, teaching parents how to help. There's an emphasis on caregivers in safety focused treatment. In regulation focused treatment, there's an emphasis on youth skill building. So overcoming survival states by building skills, focusing on spreading awareness and of triggers, but also ways that adults and caregivers in the social environment can help with regulation. Those are the major tenets that you'd be focusing on in that phase. And in beyond trauma treatment, we have building cognitive skills, telling your story or your trauma narrative or timeline, envisioning the future, having a thoughtful and planful ending, which can be therapeutic in and of itself for youth who have had so many things abruptly ended or people taken from them. To have a thoughtful ending can be a really powerful process. Okay, and section 4. So we have to build from strength within our treatment. And this is what section 4 is all about. We're assessing child strengths, we're assessing the family strengths and strengths within the social environment. So some of the things that might fall within this category are having a sense of humor, having good communication, willingness to engage in services or receive support, having natural supports, having goals. These are often not the first things that we look for, and really important for us to identify and integrate into our work. What's going well and building from there. And then section 5 focuses on barriers or what might interfere with addressing the youth's problems. So some things to consider here: the youth and families' understanding of trauma and mental health intervention. There are also often practical barriers to engaging in treatment, language barriers, transportation, work schedules, access to technology, those kinds of things. I would say to the first one, sometimes the language of trauma and mental health interventions can feel really incongruent for families. I've worked with parents sometimes who believe, for example, that their child was too young to remember anything that had happened to them or to the family. And so they see their behavior as kind of more of this like deliberate acting out rather than a trauma reaction or related to something that's triggering that happened to them in their past. And I would say this is where cultural brokers really use their incredible skills to engage families and assist with this education and coaching piece around what is trauma? How do we talk about it in a way that feels accessible? And also, what are mental health interventions? How can they be helpful?
Thank you, Heidi.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, we're gonna skip the break because we just got started. We don't need a break. We maybe need a little stretch and some water, but we're just gonna keep going because there's so much to know. Now what we're gonna do is, because we just learned so much about assessment and what we need there, we want to turn to treatment planning. And so what I would love for people to do is look at the treatment planning form if you can. As we mentioned, if you have your workbook on hand, the treatment planning form is Appendix 7. And if you don't have it, that's okay too. But sometimes it can be helpful. Okay, so as Heidi was saying, we're getting lots of good information. And so once we have gathered enough information, we really want to start transitioning into treatment planning. And we want to do it fairly soon after assessment. We don't need to know everything, right? We could be comprehensive and learn everything. We have to know just enough to understand how to formulate what's happening with the family. And we really believe that transitioning pretty quickly, maybe after 4 or 5 sessions, from assessment to treatment planning is a really good key engagement strategy for families. So just to be thinking about that, because we could stick in assessment for a long time, but we don't have to. Okay, so in TSTR, we have clinical tools to help us. And for treatment planning, we really have the treatment plan, as I said, which is appendix, now I can't remember what appendix, but in the workbook, Appendix 7. And then we also have the priority problem worksheet, and that is Appendix 6 in the workbook. Another really important form that I haven't called out here is the moment-by-moment assessment form. And that's really key because that is used to fill in the priority problem worksheet, which we will go over in a few minutes. So this figure probably looks very familiar to people. This provides us an overview of the process of treatment planning in TSTR, and it really highlights the questions that we will need to make decisions about as we plan for treatment. It probably looks familiar because it completely maps on to the 5 sections of the TSTR assessment form that Heidi just reviewed with us. So in assessment, we're really looking to gather the information we need in each of the sections, right? So we're gathering information in assessment. In treatment planning, what we're doing is we're making decisions about the information that we've gathered about these questions, right? So we have to make a bunch of decisions. So just like the assessment form, there are 5 sections. In section 1 in the treatment planning form, we really need to be determining the focus of treatment. So what concerning behaviors, both emotional and behavioral, are problematic and would benefit from being the focus of treatment. That's what we're thinking about. Ultimately, the focus of treatment will be the identified priority problem or problems and any core stressors that are impacting the youth or the family system as a whole. So that's what we'll be thinking about. The priority problems and that. So to understand, we all remember moment by moments, right? Where we assess the 3 A's across the 4 R's. And that's where youth are having shifts in their survival states when presented with a trigger. And this moment by moment assessment helps us assess each of those events in the recent past, the severity of those as well, and help us determine the priority problem, what we should be working on to reduce what's most interfering in that youth reaching their goals and values in this moment. So what is a priority problem? A priority problem is defined as a pattern of links between a traumatized youth's perception of threat in the present environment and the youth's transition to survival in the moment states. So you have a stimulus, a trigger, and then a youth response. The priority problem is extremely important to understand when doing, the priority problem is extremely important to understand when we're doing treatment because it's the formulation. It's how we understand the child's story. It's how we understand the child's behavior. So we want to take all that we know about trauma, the refugee and immigrant experience, right? The migration journey, the child's culture, with what we have gathered in the assessment, and we make meaning of the behaviors. So we operate under the assumption that human behavior makes sense. Behaviors are coming from somewhere, and our job is to find out where and why. So a priority problem in TSTR is specific and it's based on facts. So it's things that are directly observed or reported, and it's very specific. We want to get as specific as we can. So for example, when we say, what happened? Instead of they punched somebody, right? We want to get as specific as possible and say, oh, they punched someone because they are reenacting what their father did to their mother, right? So see how we kind of take out, or we really want to dig in and understand more completely instead of just they're punching people. So in TSTR, facts are, which are those things that are reported by the youth, the caregiver, or other important individuals that are related or observing the child's dysregulation or shifts in survival states. Now, facts do not have to be confirmed, right? But we're gonna understand them as truths. Facts are emphasized in TSTR, right, to ensure that the TSTR clinical and cultural broker don't jump to explanations or assumptions about the child's priority problem before methodologically gathering the facts that would explain the explanation. So we really want to root it in evidence. A priority problem is also a trauma-informed framework for understanding why a youth acts the way they do when they're triggered or confronted with a threat in their environment or perceived threat in their environment. A priority problem helps us understand who this youth is, what they have been through, and why what they are doing makes sense. And in other contexts, we're probably actually adaptive, but now in the current environment, they are not. Priority problem is really important because it's interfering with their functioning and their ability to reach their goals. A priority problem is something that we can, as providers, really build a concrete treatment plan around, which is invaluable, as we know as providers, to have something we could actually anchor our work on. And just so we know, there can be more than one priority problem. And as interventionists, we would focus at one at a time, as not to dilute down what we're doing, but we want to understand which one is most problematic and most interfering in this moment. And then we can move on to other ones. And then finally, the priority problem, like I said, is the formulation. It's our understanding of what's happening. It's a tool that when we really build it thoughtfully, it can be a really incredible gift that we can give the youth and family for them to understand what's happening. So the priority problem worksheet helps us do that. And this is the priority problem worksheet. And we use this in section 1 of the treatment plan. And we think about which problems will be the focus of treatment. Now, what's awesome about this worksheet is it pulls together the information from 3 moment by moments together in one spot so we can begin to look at patterns. So if you notice here, I don't think, on the left-hand side, there are 3 boxes. And those are the perceived threats in the present environment. So we talk about episode 1, episode 2, and episode 3. And then on the right-hand side, we have the shifts in survival states. So this is the behavior or the response to the stimulus, right? That's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we put the response, and they work together. So for the purpose of the training, we're going to walk through this worksheet, but I really wanted to kind of describe it. So here we write down the responses to the environment. So episode 1 leads to episode 1 on the right, episode 2 on the left goes to episode 2 on the right, etc. And then we bring the information together to understand the patterns of threat and the patterns of survival in the moment, the response. And we understand it along with everything that's happened to this youth. Because in TSTR, we're really looking for those patterns. We don't want to base everything on 1 episode or 2 episodes. We really ideally want to identify at least 3 events of recent problematic behavioral or emotional episodes that we can walk through in those moment by moments. And it's through this multiple assessment points that we begin to see the patterns and themes, right, that are happening. And ultimately, they lead us to the priority problem and the formulation. So each moment by moment assessment that we do gives us one more dot in the picture. I'm sure many of you have seen those pictures where the kids are drawing, there's like all these dots on a page that are numbered, and you connect 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5. And as you connect them, a picture emerges. And that's how we think about moment by moments. We're connecting those dots to gain more clarity about the child's whole story and what's happening. So again, we really are looking at features from the present moment. What's happening, right? What are the stimulus, the triggers in the youth environment? What are the most recent 3? And then what is the child's response? So we're bringing in features from the present environment, right? And then the survival states are, when we think about that continuum of regulation, this is what's happening in the re-experiencing phase. So they're lashing out, they're dissociating, they're running away, they're punching things, they're crying, they're isolating, things like that. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Luna.
Great, thank you, Alicia. So now we're going to apply everything that we just talked about, specifically with Maria and Maria's case. So we're going to look specifically at Maria's moments of dysregulation. So specific moments where she became triggered, and how that's connected to her past, and then also her survival state response. And ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to look for patterns and themes. And at this stage, because we're still, in the very early stages, we're doing treatment planning. This is just more of like a hypothesis of what might be happening. So if we take a look at 3 episodes for Maria, we have episode 1. And this is the episode that we had talked about last week on day 1 of the training, where we watched a short video where she became dysregulated in class when another student threw a pencil. Right, so this is episode 1. Episode 2 is another incident where she was at home with her mom and they got into a really big argument when mom said no, because she asked if she could go see her boyfriend. Mom said no, and that erupted into a huge explosive fight. So that's episode number 2. And then episode number 3 is another incident in class where she was asked to do more work by her teacher, and she didn't want to. She, whatever her emotions was, she was asked to do it. She got triggered and she had a very big response. So these are the 3 distinct episodes where we did moment by moment assessments on. And we're going to try to better understand what might be happening for Maria. Next slide. So then if you take those 3 episodes, right, these are the 3 survival state responses that she had, right? So for episode 1, right, with the incident in class where the other student threw a pencil, her response, her survival state response, right? So when you think about the 3 A's across the 4 R's, affect, awareness, action, regulated, revving, re-experiencing, and reconstituting, the re-experiencing is when she started to yell, swear, she put her head down on the table, and then she fell asleep. And this was the incident that we spent a lot of time talking about on day 1. So that was her survival state response for episode 1. Episode 2, her survival state response when she became triggered was she started to yell, and this was the incident at home, and then she ran out of the house. Mom didn't know where she was, a pretty significant safety concern. So that's episode number 2, that was her survival state response. And then for number 3, with the incident, another incident that took place in class when the teacher had asked her to do more work, she put her head down on the table, and then she got really upset, dysregulated, and then she ended up just leaving school in the middle of the day. So these are her 3 survival state responses. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put all of this information on this priority problem worksheet. So if you look at the left-hand side of the priority problem worksheet where it says pattern, perceived threat in the present environment, that's where you write down the 3 episodes, right? So you've got the incident in class with the pencil, then you've got the incident at home with mom, and then you've got the other incident in class with the teacher. And then on the right-hand side, you have her shifts in survival state. So the re-experiencing, how does she respond when she was triggered, right? Episode 1 corresponds with episode 1 on the right, episode 2 with episode 2, episode 3 with episode 3, right? So you can kind of see she was yelling, swearing with episode 1, head down on the table. With episode 2, she's yelling, she ran out of the house. And then with episode 3, she had her head down on the table and then she left school. Right, so this is just all information that we're gathering. And then if you take a look at all of the arrows pointing to the 2 middle boxes there, right? Those are our hypothesis or potential patterns or themes that we're noticing in terms of what's happening, right? So the pattern of perceived threat, the box on the left-hand side. So that's kind of what do we notice in terms of what might be happening with these distinct incidents or episodes? We're wondering, could it be that she is not feeling like she has much control, right? That's one potential, a very common trigger for a lot of kids and adolescents who have significant trauma histories, is not feeling like they have control. And there's many, but this is one that we hypothesized about. And then on the right-hand side, the pattern of survival in the moment is fleeing, shutting down, yelling. What does she tend to do when she's triggered, right? And this particular she's perceiving a threat. That's what she tends to do. And then on the top box, the rectangle on the top, that's the past trauma environment, right? So what has this child been through? What is her story? And so we know that she has been exposed to domestic violence. She's lost both caregivers. She has her mom back now, but she lost her for several years when her mom came to the US alone. She was exposed to a dangerous living environment back in her home country. Many transitions throughout her life with limited agency or say in kind of what happens in her life. And then she came to the US all by herself, which we know is very dangerous. And so that's the past trauma history on the top there. And then the bottom box, the rectangle, if you go to the next slide, Alicia. So this is kind of where we're putting together all of the information that we've gathered so far in terms of what we know about what Maria has been through, her past trauma, and then also information about her moment-by-moment assessments and what we've we're wondering about in terms of potential triggers and then potential survival state response. So we have when Maria is exposed to feeling like she has no control, so this is the description of the threat or signal, potential trigger, she responds by yelling, using swear words, disengaging, or fleeing. So this is the description of the survival in the moment state, the 3 A's in re-experiencing. This pattern can be understood through her past experiences of exposure to domestic violence, loss of caregivers, exposure to a dangerous living environment, many transitions with limited agency, and then migrating to the United States alone. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little role play, because now we know. So now we are, as a team, right, as the TSTR treatment team, as the clinician, as the cultural broker, the dyad are hopefully kind of figuring this out together. Maybe you're bringing this to supervision. You know, I did a moment-by-moment assessment with Maria. We did a few. This is the information that we have about her, and you've kind of figured this out as a team. Now, what needs to happen is, how do we communicate this to a youth, to a kid, to a 15-year-old girl? And how do we communicate this with other important adults in the child's life, right? So mom, maybe teachers. And so that's kind of a little bit of what we're going to demonstrate now. And so we have a little script, and we're going to do a role play where Maria will be played by Doris, and the clinician will be played by Heidi. And if you just go back one slide, Alicia, I just want to read through some questions for reflection as you're listening to the script and the role play. Just notice how the clinician is explaining her understanding of what might be happening, right? Pay attention to kind of how she's talking to, a young girl. How's the past talked about, right? How are specific incidents discussed? And how is a pattern identified? I think this is a whole other skill set that it's one thing to intellectually understand what's happening, but then to be able to communicate it using words and language that is developmentally appropriate and cross-culturally congruent, that's a whole other level of skill set that also I think is really hard to do, and it's worth talking through and practicing. And so I'm going to now pass it over to Doris and Heidi for the role play.
Thank you, Luna. Right, I'm going to pull this up for you all to read along with us. Can folks see that? Maria's priority problem statement? Okay, great. Okay, so Maria, we have been meeting with you for a few months now, and we have learned some things about you. We know that you love music, especially songs by Teenie, and that you're good at math. We also know that you've been through some hard times. Your mom told us that you saw some scary things at home when you were little, and that you came all the way to the US on your own because you wanted to be with your mom.
Yes.
Well, first, I'd like to tell you some things that I have learned about other people. When sad, scary things have happened, it's normal for people to feel lots of things. Some people have told me that they feel angry or sad or confused, ashamed, lots of other emotions too. And with all that going on inside, it's hard to focus in school and make decisions that help them reach their goals. When something reminds them of what happened, those feelings come up. And no one likes feeling bad, so they do whatever they need to get rid of those feelings. They might fight or hide or run away or become quiet. What we've learned about you is that some scary things have happened in your life, and you can sometimes feel angry, so angry that it's hard to think clearly and focus. So you do things to feel better right away in the moment, which makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
So for example, one time you wanted to go see your boyfriend. Your mom said no and told you to clean instead.
Why we're talking about this again?
I was wondering if you were going to ask that. We just want to review this quickly because we think we may be putting some pieces together and we want to see if we're right.
Fine.
Okay, so when your mom told you to clean instead of going to see your boyfriend, you said you felt mad and that you never get to do what you want. Another way to say it is that you felt like you didn't have any control. And then there was another time when your history teacher asked you to complete your work and then get started on your project. And you said you got mad because you didn't want to work on the project right after doing all of that work. You wanted a break, but weren't allowed to. So this is another moment when I'm wondering if you felt like you didn't have control, so you left class. Do you see a pattern here?
Yeah, I think so. People keep telling me what to do. I just want to be alone and do what I want. I always felt trapped at home when I was little. I want to feel free now. Now that I'm in the US, I see that my friends can do a lot more that I'm allowed to do.
Yeah, makes sense. So when you feel like you don't have control over something, like when your mom tells you what to do, or your teachers at school tell you what to do, it makes you really mad. It may have nothing to do. It may have to do with not having control in what has happened in your life back in El Salvador and now. You were trapped and couldn't do what you wanted. Bad things just kept happening and you had no say over it. And in order to feel better, you now sometimes do things to gain control over your life, like leave home to see your boyfriend or skip school.
Yes.
So that is an example of what Luna was talking about, the skill set and how we've gathered all of this information together into the priority problem and how you would start to relay that information and kind of check that information with the youth that you're working with. So Luna, pass it back to you.
Yeah, I'll pass it over to Amy.
Amy, okay.
Hey, little popcorn. Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy. I'm part of the team at the TCRC at Children's, and we just wanted to just take a pause. This priority problem piece of the work is, like Alicia said, so important. It helps us figure out, are we on the right page? Are we on the right, track of thinking? And so, we walked through how to fill out that form, which may have brought up questions. So we wanted to pause and see if you have questions about the form itself. And then we just shared how you might bring this to a youth, right? Because it's one thing for us to have it in our minds, and it's another thing to kind of present it to youth. In this case, we're working with Maria, who's a teenager. So obviously this would be done in an age appropriate way. But before we move on, just wanted to take a pause to see if there are questions, reactions, thoughts about kind of any of what we've talked about since starting. It's a lot, I know. So, a couple voices would be amazing to hear and see your faces. So does anyone want to be brave and jump in?
I'll jump in. Really, really great to see the examples. I think it really exemplifies the implementation of the theory, and it's helping me. I wonder, would you ever switch the way you do it in terms of giving the theory behind what you're doing before you go over what the moment by moment assessment is and why you're doing it before you present how it's happening in your view for the teenager? Do you know what I mean?
Can you say more what you mean by the theory?
What I mean is, like, instead of gathering information from the teenager and then kind of presenting, this is what I've noticed, say, this is our format. This is what we're doing here. Sometimes when people have, different traumas and we explain what we're doing before we actually give the example of the child. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I love that, Krista. I think, and I'll turn it to my team, but my initial thought is it speaks to me a little bit about transparency, right? Around like, why are we asking the questions we're asking, right? Like, why, Maria, are we wanting to get this information from you? So that to me falls under transparency, some psychoeducation, right? Sort of, and can really buy into engagement, right? We're not being nosy. We really, this is how we understand how kids work, right? I have pretend clients all the time, right? Where I'm saying, oh, other kids I've worked with, XYZ, you know, so that can be really helpful, Krista. I think it's really about presenting it, but also not wanting to make up stories in our own mind. You know what I mean? So sort of giving that rationale, but making sure that when we go to a youth or go to a caregiver, which we'll see in a second, we're going with concrete facts that they've shared with us, right? So I think, yeah, I think order of operations depends on kind of where you are with a youth, how old the youth is, right? Where sort of their level of understanding of why they're in treatment is. So I think leaning on your own clinical judgment with that makes sense. And I don't know if anyone else on my team or anyone else in the room, right, who's done this work has other thoughts, because there's a lot of wisdom in this group.
I would agree with you, Amy. I think that this falls into really doing trauma-informed work and providing as much education around trauma as possible to promote engagement, right? And say, this is what's happened to you and people that I've worked with who have similar experiences. This is how we understand it. Does that really resonate with you? We want to do that as much as possible with the understanding that we are experts in a certain thing that we went to school with, but that the youth and families that we work with are the experts in their experience. And we want to share power with them and understand together with them if it makes sense. And we want to keep kind of revisiting it with the pieces that might make, what might make sense or not. So I think laying it out as transparency, it really promotes engagement and outreach, and we would certainly support all of that.
I think too, one more comment I make is this is also where the dyadic work is so important, right? Because when I think about, cultural norms around sharing what's happening at home, right? Like cultural norms of secrecy, right? Like is my cultural broker going to say something in my community, right? So I think this is where working in the dyad is really important, right? Around, because the goal is for this to feel meaningful, right? And so for me, right, as a clinician, this information is meaningful to me to help come up with a priority problem, right? But how does this land with youth and families, right? And so cultural brokers need to take the lead on that as well, around helping, how do we explain this, right, to youth and families? Why are we trying to get information from them, and perhaps them taking lead on engagement and pacing for these kinds of moments, because I walk in with this with a clinical lens, which actually might not be super helpful when we're starting to introduce this to kids and families.
And I'll just channel Luna right now. Luna will always say and OSAB, who is unfortunately not with us today, but both Luna and OSAB will always remind us that we have to really be explicit about everything that we talk about. How is it relevant to the youth and family reaching their goals, right? And living within their value system. So everything that we're recommending and understanding need to explicitly be tied to what the family what's important to the family, their value system, and make sense on what they're learning actually translates to their lives as well. So I think that ties into what you were asking, Krista. Any other comments?
Yes, I'm finding it very helpful when you provide specific examples. The examples that you provided are almost identical to 3 or 4 of my clients. And it was very, very helpful to hear how you responded to the comment, why are we talking about this again? Because a lot of my teams say that, especially when there's not a lot of psycho-ed around mental health. And I loved the way you responded by saying, well, if we can notice a pattern here, that might help with a solution. And I think that also really helps destigmatize the conversation, because for a lot of my teams, they've been grounded for this, they've been reprimanded, there's a lot of shame around the behaviors. And so to talk about it again almost feels like a third parent is coming alongside and kind of talking down to them. And I like how you approach that. I found that really helpful.
Thank you. I think, Yeah, I think it's beautiful. And I don't know if you were at day one. I actually don't know who you are, but thank you for that comment. But if you were there on day one, you know, Maria was like, I don't have a problem. My mom has a problem, right? And so acknowledging that that both caregiver and child can benefit from what we have to offer, you know, and making that explicit is important as well.
Yeah, I think knowing how to navigate pushback and well, how are we talking about this? Why do you keep asking me these dumb questions? Or I don't want to do this. I don't want to be here. Knowing how to respond to that is like 90% of the work, honestly, because like we can have beautiful formulations and learn all these evidence-based interventions, but if we don't know how to engage kids, none of this is going to work. And so much of it really is, how do we get kids motivated? How do we get kids to engage? And how do we get them to really participate in this, participate in the activities and the discussions and these forms and guides, which we wouldn't recommend necessarily using the forms with the child, but in some format. I think that's such a big part of the skill that is really hard to learn and do. It takes a lot of practice. You got to just do it and mess up and trial and error over and over and over again before it's like, oh, I've got my words. I know I've got my words in my mouth, and typically saying these kinds of things, validating, doing an activity, playing a game, taking a break. All of these things is going to help with engagement, and it's going to help the kid really come out, and then we can really start doing some interventions. But yeah, it's hard. And we're gonna take a quick break right now for a couple of minutes, of 3-minute stretch break. And then when we come back, we're gonna show a little video of the clinician and cultural broker sharing this priority problem with mom, which is a whole other set of skills, right? We talked about how we would do that with Maria, the client, right? The teenager. And now we're gonna kind of demonstrate how you might do that with a caregiver when we come back.
Hi, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you got a little stretch, took some water. I was just reading through the self-care comments, maybe listen to some music, did some dancing, imagined you were outside. I love all the ways that we like to engage. It was really nice to read. Wonderful. So it looks like people are coming back. And so Luna, I will pass it over to you. I'm going to share my screen.
Okay. Okay, so just a quick, so the priority problem, just to kind of wrap this piece up, it's essentially a hypothesis or a formulation for how we understand why the child might be struggling. It's a powerful tool to provide to the child, family, teachers, and it helps the team focus in on treatment interventions. Okay, so now what we're going to do is show a 5-minute video where the clinician and the cultural broker are calling mom. So they have been working with Maria, doing tier 3 regulation focus work for, let's say, a couple of months. And they've really gotten to know her. They've done some moment-by-moment assessments. And they have come up with, maybe not a couple of months, maybe let's say a month to 6 weeks. And they have come up with a potential priority problem. And so they're going to be sharing this with mom. And as you're listening to the video and watching the video, just a couple of things to reflect on. Notice the language and words that the clinician is using to present the priority problem or the formulation to mom. So just pay attention to what she's saying. And then notice how the dyad, how they work together to respond when mom does not agree with the impact of the past, right? Which is very common with many of the caregivers that we work with. So notice how they respond to her. And now I'm gonna share screen.
Los métodos para disciplinar a María. Sabemos que no es fácil. One of the things Maria is sharing with us is that she's not trying to run out of the house and be unsafe on purpose. She's given us permission to share with you what she's feeling when she leaves. Sabemos que María sabe que no debería estar huyendo de la casa y nos ha dado el permiso de compartir con usted qué es lo que ella siente cuando se corre de la casa. When she feels like things are out of her control or that she can't get her way, it makes her very upset. We're wondering if maybe she feels the way she would feel when she was younger and things were out of her control, like when her dad was around. Cuando las cosas están fuera de su control y ella no sale con lo suyo, María se pone muy molesta. Nosotros nos preguntamos si esto tendrá algo que ver con sus recuerdos del pasado, posiblemente cuando no tenía control y estaba cerca a su padre.
No, ella no se recuerda de esas cosas, estaba demasiado joven.
No, she doesn't remember those things. She was too young. She may have been young, but children are aware and remember more than we realize. It's possible that she heard something that's affected her. Puede que ella haya sido muy joven, pero la verdad que los niños siempre están alertas y se dan cuenta de mucho más de lo que nosotros sabemos. Puede que ella haya escuchado algo y la haya afectado.
Pues él era muy amable con los niños, pero demasiado celoso conmigo. Tenía un carácter terrible y pues tuve que irme.
He was very nice with the children, but he was very, very jealous with me. He had a terrible temper, so I had to leave. You did the right thing in leaving a dangerous situation. We know it couldn't have been easy, and we can also hear how hard you've worked to give the kids what they need. Usted hizo lo correcto en salir de esa situación peligrosa y sabemos que no pudo ser fácil y que ahora usted está trabajando y ha trabajado muy duro para que los niños reciban lo que necesiten. You've made some hard choices and you want her to respect that. Usted ha hecho muchas decisiones difíciles y usted quiere que María respete eso.
Sí.
When we first started meeting, we talked about what each person's responsibility would be on the team. And one of our responsibilities was working with you to help improve communication with Maria so that she would be safe at home. And we all agreed to work together to make that happen. Cuando nosotros empezamos a reunirnos, conversamos sobre cuáles eran las responsabilidades de cada una de las personas en el equipo de María. Y nuestra responsabilidad es trabajar con usted y con ella para mejorar la comunicación entre ustedes, para que ella pueda tener una forma de poder platicar sobre sus sentimientos y se sienta más segura en su casa. Part of what we're hoping to do is help you understand how Maria is feeling so that things can feel more peaceful at home. Parte de lo que nos encantaría poder hacer es que usted pueda entender cómo es que se siente María para que las cosas puedan ser más tranquilas en casa.
Okay, I'm going to pause there. Stop share and hand it over to Amy.
Great. So we just love to hear reactions, thoughts, sort of imagine you're in a dyad, you're looking at the same priority problem worksheet and you're going, okay, now we know that we work with youth and caregivers together because caregivers are such an important part of, the family system and the support for young people. And this is the dyad kind of bringing it to the caregiver. We're going to go into breakout rooms in a little bit to talk more maybe about our own experiences, bringing these kinds of conversations to caregivers, but we'd love to hear any reactions or thoughts to this video. Yeah, a couple voices would be amazing if anyone's feeling brave.
Even just highlighting what you noticed. How did you know, or what did you notice about language or words, or how the clinical cultural dyad work together would be wonderful to illuminate, if anybody has anything to offer.
Well, I did like the acknowledgement of the fact that, even though the parent had her own interpretation about whether or not the patient was aware or not aware of the traumatic event, it was like, yes, but, and then, just kind of acknowledging that kids know more than they let on. So I thought that was, validation for mom, like saying, well, that's good. However, but then just kind of inserting our own experiences, our own knowledge of this, of how trauma works. I thought that was kind of a nice way to just kind of navigate that. And as well as, just kind of the validation of her experiences in general, that how hard it was, and, kind of validating how strong she was to get out of that situation.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, it's always, psychoeducation and validation, right? All at the same time, because I'm sure others on this call have found bringing this up can really be hard for caregivers, triggering shame, blame, guilt, all those things can sort of be surfaced as we're talking about a youth's trauma history, right? Also acknowledging that caregivers are their own humans who've had their own experiences as well, right, with trauma. And so, Stephanie, what you're highlighting here is really this kind of clinical and cultural dance we're doing, right? And we didn't show this video, but there is sort of, obviously there needs to be a meeting beforehand with a clinical cultural broker before this kind of call happens. How are we going to approach this? What happens if, how do we work together? So thank you. I'm glad, Stephanie, you noticed that.
To continue that dialogue, I really appreciate this example of shared expertise. So the cultural broker brings expertise in cultural knowledge and within a clinical setting. The clinician is bringing in their own psychological understanding of trauma and the nuance of that. And mom is bringing in her expertise in the lived experience of the family. So what I appreciate in that example is that while the clinician provides and understand psychoeducation on trauma, mom then also enriches that definition or that understanding by naming that, well, I don't agree with what you're describing because here's my lived experience. And the clinician and cultural broker do not push back on that, but rather facilitate that nuanced understanding. Like all of our families require a nuanced dialogue of what you know, what I know, how does this all work together to come to a treatment plan that makes sense to everyone?
Wow, chef's kiss. Thanks, Pamela. Any other thoughts? Great. Thank you, everyone. I think, am I turning it back over to you, Luna, for us to jump into some breakout rooms?
Yeah, let's pull up the slide and then I will. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So what we're going to do now is go into breakout rooms, and in the breakout rooms, you'll be in there for about 8 to 10 minutes. And what we would like for you to do, and if we could put these questions right in the chat as well, so people have it. how would you explain this kind of understanding to caregivers, right? What would you say to a family? So talking about, what kinds of conversations have you had with caregivers around the effects of trauma, or why their child might be behaving in the way that they're behaving? I mean, how might the US American understanding of the cause of behavior be different from how the family understands the cause? And so, really thinking about and acknowledging the fact that a lot of what we're talking about is very much, it's a very Western understanding, right? In terms of the effects of trauma and internal processes and how the past affects the present, and meaning making is very much Western, and to acknowledge that other cultures make meaning of suffering and make meaning of behaviors, make meaning of things that are happening in a very different way, right? Whether it's spiritual understanding, whether it's religious understanding. So if the understanding and meaning making is different, that's going to mean that the interventions or the treatment is also going to be very different, right? So we're working with families from all over the world with very different worldviews, very different perspectives. And that's a big part of this work. We don't want to say like, this is the only way. And because if we do that, then there's going to be a mismatch in terms of little follow through, in terms of the interventions, in terms of if, medication is involved. And so we want to make sure that we are collaborating and communicating, how do you understand what's happening? And if there is a different understanding, that we want to make sure we incorporate that. And then how do you typically get help for these kinds of problems? And if it's possible to incorporate that into the treatment plan as well. One quick example, this is a very kind of famous book that probably many of us have read while going through school. I don't know if people have read The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down by Anne Fadiman, about a Hmong refugee family. The little girl had epilepsy, and the doctors had a very Western understanding of the cause of the epilepsy, right? It was a very scientific kind of neurological understanding, and treatment was medication, and the family had more of a spiritual understanding, and their interventions, they felt like were kind of using traditional healers and things like that. And so, sadly, the Western science and medicine didn't really do a good job of communicating effectively, and so it ended up being a really sad ending. And so that's kind of one example that I use all the time when I do these trainings, just as an example to highlight how important it is to make sure that we're understanding and asking the right questions in terms of how are you understanding what's happening, and how do you typically get help for these kinds of problems. So when you go into breakout rooms, people from other cultures, or if people have worked with different people from other cultures, how have you had, what kinds of conversations have you had before in terms of understanding the cause and then the treatment? And we'll take about 8 to 10 minutes.
I wish we could spend more time talking and debriefing this stuff. I hope that you bring these conversations to your clinical team meetings and your understanding of cases. But I'd love to open it up to hear a couple voices in the large group. What came up for your groups? What do you think we would all like to hear from your smaller conversations? I'd love to hear from 2 folks if I can set a benchmark. Someone feeling brave. We're getting close and it's almost the end of our time, but I'm sure that someone would love to share something about their group. I'm sure there was no quiet time, so I'd love to hear from someone. I'm being a little pushy, I know, but we're getting close and I'm tired of hearing my own voice.
I can share. In our group, I really appreciate that, like having to hear about each other's perspectives. I think one theme that I hear from our group is the control, right? Like how does that look like in that cultural background? How does the mom agree or conceptualize the control as well. And there's like a lot of layers that we can see, including like the developmental stage. How is Maria's coping skills, emotion regulation, like, because like I think that's another piece of like psychoeducation information we can share with the caregiver about being a teenager. How's that like? Your prefrontal lobe is not fully developed, and how like to normalize that piece while validating the trauma history, recognizing like what they're going through, this whole family system. In terms of control, part of it just again, like how does that fit their understanding, their conceptualization of us a priority problem. Feel free to jump in if I missed anything, but that's a couple of things that we shared in the group.
I love that. There's so many ways to enter the work, right? So many ways to think about starting these conversations. And what I hear you saying too ties to what Pamela was saying, right? It really is a conversation, right? It really is about what is meaningful, what makes sense. And if something doesn't make sense or doesn't land, it's kind of on us to figure out, right? Where is the place where we need to be maybe more flexible, right? Yeah. Oh, it's so I appreciate the multi layers you're bringing up. Oh my gosh, I could say a million things, but I'm going to not, and maybe see if one more person wants to say something.
I just want to say we had a great conversation in our group, and I don't want to add my voice to it, but I'm wondering if somebody from my group wanted to share what we talked about. All right, I guess we move on, Amy. You did a nice job trying to facilitate that.
I'm
But
feeling jealous because I want to know what everyone was talking about, because I loved our group so much. That's what my push is. Really, it's selfish, but thank you all. I'm sure it was very chatty in those smaller groups. And like I said, please bring these conversations to your supervision, to your clinical calls, to your work as dyads. That's really where the life of the work is happening. So I hope you enjoyed connecting with each other a little bit. I'm really going to stop talking now, and we'll move through the last part of our time together. Thank you, everyone.
wonderful. Thank you, Amy. So now I will continue talking. And we will hopefully have opportunity at the end to open it up for a little more discussion or questions. That's my goal, is to kind of move forward and again, open it up. So if you have something, we would love to hear what you're thinking. If this resonates with the way that you like to do work or how you would like to do work, we want to hear that. Or if there are questions that have been created, we'd love to hear those too. So moving from section 1 of the treatment planning form. So if we look at section 1, a bulk of that is the priority problem, the core stressors, those things. And that is really unique to TSTR. The rest of the treatment planning is not that unique, right? It's what really best practices are when it comes to treatment planning. So let me share my screen. So we spent a lot of time in section 1, because that I think is the added value to the work. We always say that, you know, TSTR is not rocket science. It's just organized in a way that we think makes sense, resonates, and brings out what's relevant and important to families, and helps streamline the work so that we can really get engagement. Anyway, so continuing with the treatment planning form, if we look at section 2, this section is about making the decisions related to the identified major sources of pain, as Heidi had described. So we need to determine, why are these problems important and to whom, right? So this is where we're really thinking about what is making these behaviors problematic, right? Do they impair functioning? How concerned are the child and the caregiver about the behaviors? And this is where we're really thinking about how do we determine the child and caregiver's goals and whether the behaviors are interfering or not with their goals, right? And how are we going to understand that in terms of our intervention? So those are the decisions we need to make. That's related to the order of the priority problems. Remember, we said there could be more than one. And then also our strategies for engaging, which is much like we just talked about in the room. So if a caregiver really values the cultural understanding of what's happening with the youth and the youth is rejecting that or doesn't understand that, how can we work together to make that transparent and illuminate that for each the youth and the caregiver and come to a shared agreement about how to move forward? So we want to satisfy those sources of pain and understand that. Section 3 is really when we're thinking about what interventions will we use to address the youth's problems. And this is where we need to make a decision about the phase of treatment. And the phase of treatment indicates which interventions we're going to be using. So this is where we put the kid on the grid, right? So we're rating the vulnerability to moving into survival states. And we're identifying no survival states, or dangerous survival states in terms of the youth, the individual youth, and then the social environment's capacity to help and protect that youth from shifting into survival states. And we have stable, distress, and threatening. So where they fall on the grid determines the phase of treatment. The phase of treatment determines which interventions will be used. So if it's safety focused, are we thinking about, is this child safe to be in the environment, or do we need to be thinking about placing them in a different environment, or what strategies or interventions need to be put in place to keep that child safe? If they're in regulation focus, we need to be thinking about reducing the triggers and building coping skills in the face of triggers. And then beyond trauma, we're really putting trauma behind us and looking towards the future. We're being future oriented. So section 3 is very simple. And this is something that I love about this form is this is where we need to make decisions about the role and expectations of each member of the treatment team. And then the role and expectations of the youth and family members. And in TSTR, we actually write it out. We don't just make it implicit, but we actually say, hey, we expect you to show up every week. And if you're not going to show up every week, we want a phone call. And what we're going to do is we're also going to show up every week and we're going to be working on the priority problem, right? And this is what we're going to do. And we list it out so that families and youth and us as team members know what we're doing. Section 4 is really related around strengths, right? So we talked about that. We really look and try to identify what strengths does the child bring, which strengths does the caregiver bring, and what kind of strengths does the environment bring that we can leverage to address the youth's problems. So everyone has strengths and abilities to bring to the table, and how can we utilize those to meet the needs of the youth and the family. And then finally, for section 5, we want to be thinking about and making decisions about what barriers are there, what might we need to address to get the youth and child into treatment. So this could be related to, do we need to do psychoeducation on why trauma-informed therapy may be helpful for the youth and family? How may they benefit from the services that we have to offer? It could also be practical barriers like transportation, having sessions at a time that makes sense for the family, things like that. So really problem solving, practical barriers. And then finally, just thinking about the treatment plan itself, we really think that, in TSTR, the treatment plan should be very focused, clear, engaging, and it needs to address the problems that are relevant and meaningful to the families. So we anchor it on that priority problem that we've co-created with the families. It needs to be based on information that we gathered in the assessment phase, right? And really anchored on kind of the shifts in survival states and the events that are causing those survival states. Ideally, we want to decide on the treatment plan as a team, both like all of us, right? The youth, the family, the culture broker, and the clinician. We want to sit down and decide what we're going to work on. And then we also believe that the treatment plan can be revisited as new information emerges. So as we begin to build trust with families, oftentimes more information comes out or different triggers emerge at different times. And so if we think that treatment isn't progressing in the way that we would hope, there's something getting in the way, then we revisit it and we put the kid on the grid again and we revisit the priority problem. And so we really want to just make sure that our services are relevant, and we're focused on that. In TSTR, we have what we call a treatment agreement letter. And this is actually a letter that we write out to families. And we say, hey, we've asked you a lot of questions, and we think that we might have some understanding of how best to help you right now. And so we fill out this form, right? You can see it here. We say, dear family member, and then we sign it. And then we write out, you know, we've identified a number of problems we believe should be the focus of treatment. Here they are. And we don't want to overwhelm them with like a million different problems that we've identified, but one or two that are most salient, we list here. And then this is what we understand is most important to you, right? And then we list out, here's what we can do to help. Here is what we will do to help. So this is like going from the treatment plan to here's our agreement. We list out everybody's roles and we sign it. We present it to the family. We sign it, they sign it. It could also be if written out is not preferable given kind of, you know, pre-literacy or just kind of an aversion to paperwork, which we often know refugee and immigrant families can have. You can do this orally too. Or sometimes we've had people record it and then it's like a verbal conversation as well. So you can be creative about it. But this is just like, hey, we're going to agree to work together. And this is what we're going to agree to work on. And then finally, we have Ready, Set, Go. And Ready, Set, Go really talks about the readiness to engage in treatment. And in TSTR, readiness is attained when, just like we've been talking about, the clinical cultural dyad and the family agree that they agree on the specific problem that will be worked on in treatment, and then also the plan for solving that specific problem. So we have a shared understanding of what the problem is and how to solve it. It's also important to problem solve, like I was saying, practical barriers and make sure that youth and families understand what is expected of them and what they can expect from engaging with us. So once all of these are achieved, we say you're ready to go. All right. So in terms of the future, what next? We have one more day of training. That will be next Monday, the 23rd of January. That one will be 3 hours. It will go from 10 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to mainly focus on the regulation focus phase of treatment, which is our tier 3 in the model, but we're also going to briefly talk about tier 4 or the safety focused phase of treatment. As we understood, Maria's in this cycle of been placed on the grid when she arrived to us in safety focus and now is emerging into regulation focus. So we want to highlight that work through Maria. All right, and now we have final thoughts, questions. We'd love to hear from everybody. So I'll stop sharing and we can have a conversation. All right, we did a lot of talking day 1, right? And day 2. How are people feeling? How's this landing? Is it making sense?
This has been very helpful, especially the different scripts that we've used and the videos, watching the videos have been incredibly helpful.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. So we did put an evaluation into the link, and we'd love for you to fill it out. I did see in the chat, somebody said, are the forms available in other languages? Currently, we do have some available in Spanish, and that is the only language we have thus far. What other comments or questions? I agree, Danielle. I think our team, Doris and Luna and Amy and Jeff, have worked really hard on these training videos, and I think they've done a fantastic job. So I'm glad that people are finding them helpful. What other thoughts?
So we put the training evaluation link right in the chat. So if you could take a couple of minutes in the final few minutes that we have left to complete that, we would greatly appreciate it.
I have a question, and I don't know if this was covered on day one, but just kind of identifying the safety states, because I feel like that could be tricky. And just also saying that someone doesn't have any safety states kind of was interesting to me, because I would imagine that everybody would have some kind of safety state.
Such a great question. Did I just jump over somebody? I'm going to respond. So we call them survival states in trauma systems therapy. And what those are really talking about is, I know, no survival states. What does that mean, right? You like that, that's so funny. But we define that as when presented with a reminder of the past or a trigger that we're able to cope. So if we're presented with a traumatic reminder, we're able to kind of roll it off and kind of continue to move. We can move through the day like regulated. It's fine. It's not triggering to us. And that's where we're calling no survival states. So that's a very specific thing. And so then we say survival states if we're presented with that threat or that past reminder, and then we respond in some way, like we dissociate or we lash out or we start crying. That's where we get into survival states, and dangerous survival states are when we're harming ourselves or others, right? We're running away, we're doing a lot of risky behaviors, we're doing drugs, things like that. So that's the distinction between the three. So thank you for bringing that up. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking how that could also be difficult. Like if someone's disassociating, they may not realize they're doing that. So just trying to figure that out could be tricky.
100%. 100%. And that's why we want to know, and oftentimes, right, that's why we want to be gathering those moment by moments to understand, oh, maybe they really are disassociating, right? And totally checking out. It is a really hard thing to discern, but the more you can gather the information, the better. Any other comments or questions?
I really appreciated seeing completed forms of the paperwork. I think like all of us probably fill it out different, and it's just nice to see like, oh, ideally it could look like this. I find myself putting very clinical terms in our paperwork, and that's not helpful. So seeing exact, like they said they yell, then you put that in the document. I think so that was a really good reminder for me to not jump ahead and conceptualize, to instead be at that stage of filling out the paperwork with the exact language used, with the exact what is happening very concretely. So thank you for that.
Such a great point. Yeah, we want to not be jargony. We want to meet people where they are. It's like, as clinicians, anyway, clinicians are really, our job is to make those assumptions. And in TSTR, we ask you to not do that, to gather the evidence and then work with the family and youth to formulate. We can make our hypotheses, but we really need to be checking that all the time and anchoring it in actually what's being observed or reported. Thank you, Pamela. All right, we have 2 more minutes. Any other questions, comments, things you liked, didn't like?
Please fill out that survey. We are, we're going to meet again for day 3, if you can believe it, next week. And we really do look at those responses as we're sort of tailoring what we're going to do with you all next. So it means something to us, just for you to know that. A final plug. Just 2 minutes would mean the world for us, and making sure we're giving you all something that's meaningful, right? Talk about being meaningful. So.
All right. Well, once you filled out the evaluation, please have a wonderful day. Like, everybody loves a training that ends on time. So go have fun. I hope you get to indulge in some self-care, get outside, dance, whatever it is you love to do.